want to go back to Mr. Bryce and talking about how the plans put forward by my Democrat colleagues and the Biden administration will impact rural communities, and particularly the transportation bill. There's no funding for new roads. Those are, and there's a huge amount of funding for mass transit. That really doesn't help people in rural communities, what many of my liberal friends consider flyover country. Doesn't that create not only an economic injustice, but an energy injustice for families and households in those areas?
Well, Representative, this is one of the big challenges that Congress has to deal with is the urban-rural divide. And this is present in, of course, in our politics where mostly Democratic voters live, or a lot of Democratic voters live in cities, and more conservative and Republican voters live in what you call flyover country. But it becomes particularly, I think, problematic when it comes to the transportation sector because, as you point out rightly, a lot of this money is directed toward projects that will benefit people who live in cities and provide more mobility in cities. But I talked about California in my written testimony and also in my spoken testimony because it's another example there of some of these inequities about the concentration of EVs being a lot of take up in urban areas, but not in rural areas.
You've written an article that was in the New York Post entitled "Lower Middle Class Americans Will Pay a Fortune for Biden's Wind Power Plan," and you talk about some of that. But I also would like to bring to the committee's attention a letter from Jim Cooper, I believe is an African-American member of the Budget Subcommittee in the California Assembly. And he talks about the Public Policy Institute of California reports that California residential electric power rates are almost 56% higher than the average in other states. And he really talks about how, a point you just made about the electric vehicles, about the renewables, and how most of the benefit of that's going to the coastal cities, and the brunt of the cost is being borne by people who really can't afford it. I want to move
go ahead.
to something else, and in particular, going back to, as we think about our transportation grid, how important it is to build new roads, and particularly in urban areas. We talk about the amount of pollution that and emissions in those areas, but one of the reasons we have so much, and there's a great report from the University of Alabama, they've been doing a study with Texas A&M University, and it's based on data taken every 15 minutes at hundreds of locations for almost every mile of major roads in 494 U.S. urban areas, looking at the amount of the impact of congestion. And the way you reduce congestion is not to try to force every urban area to adopt mass transit and get people out of their cars and then on trains and buses. It is to improve your infrastructure, your transportation system, reduce the amount of time that people spend in congestion in their cars, and it reduces emissions. Do you want to comment on that?
Well, I don't know the study you're talking about, sir, but I would make one quick comment about the issue of vehicle miles traveled, which, you know, I'm just studying what's going on in California. The Latino groups, a group called the 200, which is a coalition of Latino leaders in California, have sued the state over their VMT rules because they're saying that these are regressive, that they are increasing costs and reducing mobility for low and middle income consumers, and that's a problem because mobility is essential for people who are working class folks, and they want to own a home, and having higher VMT charges means that it limits their ability in terms of home ownership because it limits their mobility.
I recommend people read your articles in the Post, but I've got one other thing. In your testimony, you commented on the threat that we have to our power grid. And there's a report from Lloyd's of London on the solar storm risk to North American electric grid. And I keep telling people that we've got other issues that we need to address that I think are more pressing than CO2 emissions. And I'll just quickly tell you that the total U.S. population at risk of extended power outage from a Carrington-level event, that was a severe event in 1859, is between 20 and 40 million with durations of 16 days to 1 to 2 years and a cost of $600 billion to $2.6 trillion. we have got to prepare for things like that.
I agree with you, Representative, and this is it's an issue I bring up in my new book, that the electric grid is very fragile, and we've seen the fragilization of the grid, these extended outages. It's one reason why more Americans are buying standby generators. But yes, the solar flares or the Carrington event could be catastrophic for the U.S., and this is something that a lot of people have talked about the need to invest in grid protection and grid adaptability and resilience.
I'd appreciate seeing your work on that. I yield back.